from Colorado, Mr. Tipton, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to address an ongoing environmental review process within my district that I firmly believe represents yet another in a long line of abuses of private property rights by the federal government, and more specifically the land management agencies that oversee the majority of the land in the United States. The outcome of this process will likely set a disturbing precedent under which the integrity of contracts with the federal government that they enter into with private property rights is undermined. The Bureau of Land Management is currently reviewing 65 existing oil and gas leases issued in the White River National Forest beginning in 1993. This retroactive review was prompted by a 2007 decision on 3 of the leases by the Interior Board of Land Appeals, in which the BLM was found to have not formally adopted a Forest Service environmental policy analysis that was utilized to be able to make these leasing decisions, basically what amounts to an administrative oversight. It should be emphasized that there are extensive environmental reviews that did in fact take place, that the BLM played a role in that process. The agency argued as much during the Board Land of Appeals during the review. The fault was simply that the BLM needed to sign on the dotted line, and the Board expressly made this option available to remedy the problem. However, instead of adopting that common-sense approach, the BLM succumbed to political pressure from the environmental extremists and determined to revisit every one of the leases issued since 1993. The new proposal from the BLM deals with leases in one of 2 ways. It either imposes new, significantly restrictive stipulations that were not in place at the time of the original leases when they were acquired, or it outright revokes the leases. The federal government is acting as nothing more than a highway robber in this case and in many others, robbing citizens and businesses of property that they have bought and paid for, telling us that we should simply be grateful that there's someone looking out for our greater interests. I highlight this particular process because should the BLM follow through with certain actions of its proposed sanctions, it will set a precedent that not only for oil and gas development, but for any lessee or permittee who, in entering into a contract in good faith with a federal agency, may see their lease or permit threatened with retroactive revocation or severely restricted based on any flimsy pretext. Many important industries rely on federal leases and permits, including livestock grazing, recreation, and renewable energy. And no business can successfully operate if its license to do so no longer enjoys protections against arbitrary cancellations or changes depending on the ideology of the current occupant of the White House. Numerous stakeholders and local governments recognize that the BLM's final decision would have impacts far beyond those of the specific leases in question, and undertook efforts to draft detailed and substantive feedback to the agency. This is a very laborious and time-consuming process, yet the BLM provided only minimum public comment during this period and required by law, and the agency's scheduled comment period overlapped with Thanksgiving, Christmas, and the New Year holidays. It also overlaps another environmental review comment period for the well-known Roan Plateau, which involves many of the same stakeholders and local governments and has been under review in some form since the late 1990s. As such, several stakeholders and local governments, with the support of several members of Colorado's congressional delegation, requested for a modest extension of the comment period. These extension requests are routinely granted by the federal agencies in recognition of the technical nature of these issues, interruptions due to federal holidays, and when there are several similar issues under simultaneous review. Despite this, the requests in this instance were dismissed out of hand. One can only conclude that the BLM is afraid of the scrutiny that could result from them effectuating a government taking of property rights in guise of rectifying an administrative error from over 20 years ago. It is abundantly clear that the BLM intends to ramrod through a decision that will trample on lease owner rights by canceling or altering leases to the point as to make them economically unviable. This is unfortunately in line with the disturbing trend of federal agency abuses to private property rights, whether it is the Forest Service's repeated attempts to leverage special use permits to forcibly acquire private property rights as regards to water, or the EPA's determination to classify every ditch and puddle as the water of the United States, to further insert itself into the everyday lives of ordinary, hardworking Americans. Property rights and integrity of contracts are at the very foundation of our economic system. Yet too often federal agencies casually cast these important considerations aside. If the BLM is confident that it is making the right decision and is willing to defend it, then they should have no problem providing additional time for the public and other interested stakeholders to be able to comment on the proposed actions in the White River National Forest.
Expired.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I